you for coming here. My name is Bogdan. I'm a journalist at INCYBER. Today we're going to discuss people whom we really rely on, but who are actually also very malicious. And those who will be able to discuss this the best are with us today. They're also a bit under pressure. The experts that are to my right here, so I'll let them introduce themselves. Hello everyone. Just let me know if the microphone isn't working. Livia Tiberna. I work as a CTI analyst at Sequoia, a French business on detection of malware. So I'm a member of the detective research group, and that feeds us with information. I'm a specialist on cybercrime and notably ransomware.
And bonjour. My name is Cody Barrow. Unfortunately, I do not speak French, so I will try to follow along a little bit here. I work for Eclectic IQ, which is a threat intelligence platform vendor in the Netherlands. And there I am the vice president for intelligence and strategy right now. I am coming to you as an American. For the last 20 years, I've been in this industry, and about half of that was at the Pentagon in the United States, and with United States Cyber Command. And I also bring the insight of leading financial institutions and our understanding of the threat landscape at Eclectic IQ. So I look forward to a bit of dialogue over this next hour with you.
Alors, bonjour tout le monde, Karim Abilama.
Hello everyone, my name is Karim Abila. I'm SE Director at International Business Witness. I'm introducing myself in French, but I will continue the session in English. NetWitness is a platform for response to threats, and we have a dedicated team for this. This business was founded in the 90s by a specific mission, a secret mission on behalf of the American government in order to carry out forensics research, and it has developed and evolved quite recently. So I'm very pleased and honored to be able to share some insights with you today on this particular topic. So as you've understood, it will be a bit of a mix of French and English, because some of you may be able to use the interpreting channels for the language of your choice. So why this topic today? There have been some changes in the cybercrime. There have been a number of arrests recently, and the experts who are with us today are following this on a day-to-day basis.
Let's start with you, Karim. What are your observations on the last year on the activity of especially the cybercrimes and the ransomware?
Yeah, it's definitely been an interesting year. Ransomware gangs actually are really remaining very notorious. That's what we're observing. So we do have, obviously, we do a lot of threat research, and over the last year, while they're definitely financially motivated, and that's the primary objective, but equally what we're seeing is that they're being weaponized a lot by nation states, right? So, and that's something we're observing. They're definitely one of the key things that actually changed in terms of the evolution last year is the way they're organized. On their side, they're kind of sharing a lot of information together. They're definitely much more structured. They're also equally sharing infrastructure, cross-hiring, and morphing, right? So and that's kind of really scary on this side of the house, right? So that's one of the key things. But equally, what they're doing is they're kind of not selling more their toolkits. Which is more known as ransomware as a service nowadays, right? So they're selling it to less sophisticated actors. So basically, they're lowering the entry of the barrier for less sophisticated actors to kind of speed the proliferation of ransomware at a much faster pace, right? So that's one of the key observation around the evolution. Obviously, another key thing is the techniques are also evolving, right? So there's equally sophistication in terms of the tactics and the techniques, in terms of the evolution, and there's some known gangs that we heard about in the news. So Lockbit is definitely one of those gangs we've been tracking actively. Last year, I'm sure it's not a surprise, you've probably heard in the news, they released a bug bounty program, right? First ransomware gang to do that in 2022, $1 million bug bounty program for whoever actually shares data with them on any organization that has their data leaked. So they're really definitely evolving. There's multi-staged campaigns. There's double and multiple extortion as well. There are techniques and tactics that are being used in the last year, and it's definitely trending in this direction moving forward.
Thank you, Karim, for this introduction. Cody, can we say that at one moment these groups just crossed some kind of red line and authorities decided to respond it?
I would say that yes and no. So there are no formal red lines per se, but we have seen, I would say, the general acceptance in the United States, which is my former area, that any ransomware targeting of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors as set out by Presidential Policy Directive 21 some years ago, I think it was maybe 2013, is a de facto red line. And so in 2021, many remember when REvil, which is now defunct, at least largely defunct, which we can go into a little bit more on that, and its likely associate DarkSide shut down JBS and then Colonial Pipeline. Maybe the order in those is reversed, I can't quite recall, but those represented de facto red lines for the Joe Biden administration. And so then Joe Biden issued what you might call a warning to Vladimir Putin, who we think is most likely, at least in some sense, complicit in most of these operations, or his administration is, that you may not target these 16 sectors. And so these 16 sectors represent everything from healthcare to energy, and there are all of them on the U.S. Cyber Infrastructure and Security Agency website, CISA. And then we saw that the Russian FSB arrested at least 2 members of the REvil ransomware gang, at least allegedly. And that was that, right? We thought that that at least showed that Russia was able to be shaken. However, it seems, truthfully, that most likely, I think anyway, that was probably to stave off the U.S. response. I was reading recently that those Russians who were members of REvil were their case just ended, I think in February or March, and the Russian court was not able to find sufficient evidence of criminal wrongdoing, at least for any of the major charges. And now, of course, that's out of the media. Hype has sort of dissipated, and so I think that most likely that was just in the moment. I will say one more bit about the red line, which I think is, or the de facto red line, which I think is notable. Also in 2021, the U.S. Office for Foreign Asset Control, which is a subordinate entity to the U.S. Treasury Department, did issue guidance stating that you may not or you may be subject to sanctions for essentially paying ransoms or facilitating ransoms. So we saw that actually operationalized with the sanctioning of a Russian exchange shortly thereafter, and I think that that's also something that will have some effects.
Thank you, Cody. Livia, vous qui travaillez aussi sur ces groupes.
So Livia, you're also working on these particular groups,
parfois ça tient un peu à rien.
and one can be arrested quite easily.
Est importante pour déceler
To what extent is human error
derrière tout ça?
contributing to these arrests?
Effectivement, le facteur humain, il devient de plus en
So
plus
the human
important,
factor is increasingly
pour toutes les
important
menaces
for all
cybercriminelles,
threats,
mais
all cybercriminal threats.
Alors, là,
In
il faudra
ransomware
faire la
notably,
distinction entre
we should
les
here
menaces
really
dont on
distinguish
parle
between the
aujourd'hui,
threats
parce
that
que
that we
si on se
speak of
concentre sur les
today. If we
ransomware,
focus on
il y a d'un autre côté les
ransomware, you
ransomware qui
have,
se
on the
propagent,
one hand, those
donc il y a
that
une très
propagate
faible
very
implication
easily,
humaine,
and there is a very
le sujet
small
d'aujourd'hui,
implication on a human
c'est
level.
plus les ransomware
But
qui
you also
agissent en
have
tant que ransomware
ransomware
service, donc
that
les
are
groupes
known
qui
as
s'organisent
service
vraiment en
ransomwares,
cartel et qui
so
ont
to
une
speak.
répartition interne
And they have a
très
very internal
précise, une optimisation
internal
des tâches,
structuring. They have
qui
a
sont,
way to
pour la
optimize
plupart,
specific
russophones.
tasks,
Et donc, c'est ces
notably
groupes-là
those
qui
Russian-speaking
impliquent vraiment
ones,
une
and
très
those
forte,
groups
value humaine derrière, c'est-à-dire que c'est
take into
un
account a very high human
des
operational
personnes
system,
qui administrent ça derrière. Ça veut pas dire
and those
que
that administer it
c'est
behind
pour ça
behind the
aussi qu'il y a la
scenes
question
are
du
also
ciblage qui se pose.
involved.
Est-ce qu'ils
There is
ne
also
ciblent
the
pas
question of
Eh
targeting.
bien,
So
quand
do
on
they
se dit
target or
que,
not?
il y a une personne qui se rend compte dans quel réseau elle est entrée.
So
Voilà, le discours de on n'a pas su, on a attaqué un hôpital mais on n'était pas conscient.
So there is a question on how they target the specific
specific
sites, for example, hospitals, and there's always the question of human error in that regard. What we notice in terms of the information that we have and the data, a large majority of these operations and of the arrests
il se repose sur ça.
are founded on human
C'est
error.
plutôt naturel. Et nous aussi, en tant que victimes des cyberattaques,
As we are
c'est
victims of these cyber attacks, the human vulnerabilities
dans ce piège. De
make
leur
us
côté,
fall
c'est
into this
pareil.
trap, and on their side, that's the
Les
same.
forces de l'ordre, très souvent,
So
mis sur ça
the authorities are really
puis
betting
voilà,
on this
faut vraiment,
idea of human error.
C'est human behind ransomware.
So human behind ransomware, there is that particular slogan.
Dans le temps,
Human behind ransomware.
C'est ce qui nous permet aussi de
Over time, it enables us to
détecter des TTP,
detect threats, those TTP, those specific techniques that are particular to those groups. It's very lucrative, very profitable.
Tout le temps les mêmes techniques,
They always use the same strategies and techniques
dans les sociétés
to tap into societies. It's a model that is working en masse,
sur le court terme et rapporter
on
le plus
short term as well, and those that are most profitable. These are groups that don't really have the luxury of time.
La plupart, voilà, ils misent vraiment sur cet effet de
They really bet on this
d'optimisation de techniques,
optimization of techniques on a very large scale, and that's where human error can interfere, because these are not systems that are fully automatic. It's quite a long response, but to say all that, to say yes.
Vous disiez on peut compter sur ça, enfin du moins
You're saying that the authorities can also count on groups. For instance, certain groups that can make other groups fall. I remember one particular group in a forum. There was a member of Logbit who had responded, "You will see." And the following day, Europol knocked at their door, and we can see how these groups can fall. So is this something that you have seen repeatedly?
Ça serait des suppositions, on peut avoir
These could be hypotheses, and we can elaborate on this in our discussions. What the ransomware groups say on their platforms, on their exchange platforms, can be very useful to know about. We can notice some tensions and rivalries, but there are only, this can be limited to particular declarations. From what we have observed, it's not necessarily what makes ransomware groups fall. On the contrary, this can seem quite surprising, but it seems that certain operations between groups have evolved in such a way that, for instance, 2 years ago, groups wanted to keep an internal structure that was quite distinct from that of other groups, so that an affiliate
qu'ils
could
travaillent
not
pour
necessarily
beaucoup de groupes
be
différents,
collaborating.
emploient deux ransomware
It's what
différents.
was
On le
quite
voit un peu
badly
moins,
seen
cette
that one
restriction
person would
aujourd'hui.
work for different
Ça
groups.
fait ressortir un peu la question des
And this
affiliés
raises the
et nous,
question
ça nous impacte un
of
peu dans notre suivi parce que
allies, as it
le
were,
suivi des groupes en tant que
in order
groupe,
to follow up on these
ça
groups.
fait un peu moins sens aujourd'hui.
It
La
seems a
question
bit
se pose
less
de
likely
est-ce qu'on
today. It
devrait
seems to
pas
be
suivre
quite
les
nonsensical,
affiliés, surtout.
but
On
we
commence à avoir de
should
plus en plus
actually also
de données
look
publiques qui
into
parlent des personnes,
those
des affiliés.
affiliates.
Donc un affilié, c'est
So
la
an
personne qui va
affiliate person
acheter
is the person who
clé en
will
main un logiciel
buy
malveillant et qui va le
a
distribuer. Eh bien, on voit de
malicious
plus en plus de
software,
témoignages des
and we can
affiliés
see a
justement qui
number of
déploient à 2,
witnesses
3,
that are
voire plus de
deploying
ransomware
2,
différents.
3, or even
Et
more
dans leur
ransomwares.
règlement interne,
In
il n'y a rien
their
qui les
internal
empêche de le
regulation,
faire.
there is nothing that prevents them from doing that.
Vous pouvez continuer, hein, si vous voulez.
You can continue if you like.
Allez-y.
Juste un des cas intéressants.
Go ahead.
Non, pas le bon bouton. Okay, because one of the interesting case this year is the Hive site disrupting. Well, they didn't arrest them, but it's still quite impactful, this kind of strike. Does it mean that today ransomware groups are even vulnerable in Russia?
Well, there's a little bit to that. I do think they're vulnerable. I think that they're vulnerable even in Russia. I think that ransomware group members are safer in Russia because the authorities, as with the previous answer, still are resistant to arrest and prosecution, especially still if you don't focus on former Soviet Union states, or B, I would say attract the ire of the U.S. president openly, right? I think that's what we've learned. We've also learned that probably even in the second instance, there aren't necessarily super severe consequences long-term so far, right? But I think that what we're really seeing from lessons from Hive is that the de facto red line that we discussed before is probably not that clear, and it means that now the U.S. and the U.K. and the Netherlands and a lot of allied nations will react. Now, even if that doesn't mean that there are changes to the way the Russian government acts, it does mean that, for example, the U.S. administration, having just released its national cybersecurity strategy through the Office of the National Cyber Director, which is a newish office established, I think, in 2021, they can now use more authorities and go further. So, for example, previously, I think we generally collectively viewed ransomware as a criminal issue, right? Now, in the U.S., which is a nation of laws and regulations, they can now view it also as a national security issue. So this means that if you were to examine, for example, terrorism, this is a challenge that is beyond criminal authorities and beyond just intelligence authorities. Ransomware was only criminal. So in the US, there is a law that, or a series of laws that allows you to operationalize the authorities only for criminal code issues. Now that ransomware is formally a national security issue, you can now operationalize military and intelligence and criminal authorities. So are they safe in Russia? Well, I think their infrastructure is a lot less safe. I think that the threat actors themselves won't have vacations because they will be arrested outside of the former Soviet states, or really I should say outside of the Russian Federation, and some certain other nations under its closest influence. But for the most part, I do not think that we've seen much or enough significant change to say that they're no longer safe inside of Russia?
Karim, do you have any recommendation against this group which are still safe in Russia?
Yeah, for sure. We do a lot of job in terms of at NetWitness in terms of kind of helping organizations of all sizes, right? So from critical infrastructure to non-critical infrastructure as well, kind of really investigate data breaches, and a lot of this is ransomware related, right? So one of the latest investigations that our incident response group has actually conducted was in a Northern European online betting and online gambling, and that's pretty recent. And in fact, when we look at the sophistication, basically of the payload itself, there's a mix of actually sophistication in terms of the payload, but there's equally to the point made earlier. There's the initial access is pretty basic, right? So we're still dealing with spear phishing. We're still dealing with abuse of legit channels, right? That are used in the organization. So there's the poor cyber hygiene of organization is definitely leading to those ransomware gangs really thriving, right? So there's a lot of effort from law enforcement, and that's applauded. But we shouldn't forget that those efforts take time, right? So to track a gang from the moment of conception or of inception till actually being able to kind of track them down and actually do and while there's been progress, do an actual operation, right? So with different jurisdictions, that can take somewhere so far. In some cases, it's taken more than years, right? So what we try and help organizations with is really understand from a cyber hygiene, right? What is it that they can do better? There's obviously the usual suspects out there, which is, hey, you've got to have a proper backup infrastructure. Your backup needs to be clean. It needs to be isolated. You need to test your recoveries. Those are the usual suspects. You've got to patch on old vulnerabilities, and it's not always easy to do, right? So when you're a larger enterprise, chances are there's always going to be gaps. So during one of the engagements that I was referring to, we actually found traces of Conti, which is a group that is actually, again, with heavy Russian affiliations, and that is actually kind of really using double, and we saw multiple extortion techniques in that particular engagement, right? So leaking the data and actually threatening to kind of publish that data to just make sure that the ransom is actually paid. So along the usual suspects of the recommendations, and after we've had this engagement for a couple of months, a lot of what helped actually our group is the visibility. Most of the organizations have lack of visibility into what's really happening, right? So, and those are visibility gaps that exist nowadays in terms of what really happening in your environment, your network, and your endpoints. Right? There's always gaps, right? There's places where you can't really deploy technologies to be able to kind of give you that visibility, and that's what we kind of advised alongside the recommendation around the best practices and the cyber hygiene that needs to be followed. Really bridge your visibility gaps, and especially around detection, so that you can actually be better prepared to fend off the attacks. One thing I always say is, on the attacker side, you've got to be right only once. Whereas on the defense side, you've got to be right every single time, right? And just one breach might actually cost you reputation. Obviously, larger ransoms, which is something we're also seeing nowadays.
Livia Cody parlait tout à l'heure de.
Livia Cody discussed earlier that the cyber criminals won't be able to go on holiday, as it were, elsewhere. Does this mean that there will no longer be Russian hackers in the Côte d'Azur in the Mediterranean area? Is that to say that they'll have more issues hiring people on their forums?
Eh bien, On reste sur l'écosystème
If we look at
russophone,
the
c'est l'écosystème qui est directement
Russian-speaking
impacté,
ecosystem, which
par
is being
cette
impacted by this
évolution.
evolution,
Effectivement, pour le contexte,
effectively,
on pourrait rappeler le
in this
fait
context, we
que
can
dans
remind
l'espace
ourselves that
ex-soviétique et notamment
in
en
the
Russie,
ex-Soviet states, notably in
on
Russia,
observe qu'il y a une certaine
we can
règle
observe a
numérique
certain,
qui est,
a kind of
tant que les
unwritten
cybercriminels ne
rule.
touchent pas nos réseaux à nous,
Cybercriminals
on va
don't
pas
affect
trop
our
s'intéresser
network.
à eux en tant que force de
If
l'ordre.
they don't, we won't really be
Ce
interested
qui
in their
fait
case.
qu'aujourd'hui,
And this
on parle
means
d'un
that today
écosystème plutôt
we are
fermé,
discussing a kind of
où
closed-in
la règle
ecosystem where
camaraderie fonctionne
the role,
toujours.
the
Donc, quand
role
on va
of
chercher des
camaraderie
affiliés,
isn't
les
actually
russophones
such.
vont chercher toujours des
There'll
russophones. Ou,
be a kind of solidarity
des gens qui
amongst
sont issus de la même région,
Russian-speaking or
des
those who
pays
are
ex-soviétiques.
from
Ça se
the
voit dans
same
le
ex-Soviet
ciblage
states.
également.
We can see that in
La
the
plupart des
targeting
groupes
systems and
ransomware as a
structures as
service
well.
aujourd'hui,
In
ils
terms
vont
of the
pas
ransomware
toucher aux
services,
pays de
they will
l'ex-Union
not affect
soviétique.
states
Petite
from
parenthèse,
ex-Soviet
l'Ukraine en fait
states,
partie et
and Ukraine is part of it
étonnamment,
as
ça n'a
a
absolument pas changé depuis
as a
avant,
binote.
depuis la guerre
And
en 2022.
Russia hasn't really
Mais voilà, ce qui fait
entered that
que
space.
cette protection
This means that the
elle
protection
fonctionne tant que les cybercriminels restent
works so long
en
as the
Russie ou
cybercriminals
dans d'autres
stay
pays
in Russia
ex-soviétiques.
or other
De
ex-Soviet
notre
states.
côté, on a vu des échanges
On the
au
other
début de la
hand, we
guerre
have seen some
quand,
exchanges at the
quand il se
beginning
disait,
of the war in
eh
Ukraine.
bien, on est un peu pris entre deux
We are sort of
risques.
torn
D'un côté, il y a la
between two risks.
mobilisation.
On the one hand, the
Là, si on parle de Russie, par
mobilization.
exemple,
If you speak of
et
Russia, for
sachant
instance,
que pour la plupart des cas, il s'agit des personnes qui
knowing
n'ont
that
pas de travail
in a large
équivalent
number of cases, they don't have an
côté
equivalent
légitime
job
du marché du travail.
on
Donc,
the job
ils
market, on
sont,
the legitimate, on
ils tombent
the
plutôt sur cette
legal
loi
job
de
market.
mobilisation.
So they
Évidemment, il n'y
really
avait pas grand désir de
bet
leur
on
côté
this kind of
de partir et faire la
mobilization,
guerre. Et d'un
and
autre
there
côté,
is
pour
no
échapper, parce qu'ils font la plupart,
no
c'est partir
willingness for
ailleurs,
them
en
to go
Turquie,
to war.
en Iran.
And we can notice something else in
Sauf
Turkey
que
and
pour quitter
and
la
Iran,
Russie, encore une fois, si je prends cet exemple, il y a les forces de l'ordre
leaving
internationales qui
Russia
risquent de tomber dessus.
would mean that the
Et pour pas rester
international
que la
law
Russie,
would fall
on peut
upon
donner
them.
notre exemple de
We can also
l'Ukraine
give another example of
et
Ukraine.
de l'infostealer Raccoon. Donc
The
c'était un
infrastructure
opérateur qui
Raccoon,
distribuait un logiciel malveillant
a distributor that
doté de
was
capacité de vol
that was
d'information.
that could steal data, a mode of
Une
ransomware that could
menace
steal
russophone
data.
comme la plupart, mais on n'avait pas beaucoup
Most of these are
d'informations sur où il est
Russian-speaking
localisé. Et
threats,
à
but
un
we didn't
moment
have
donné,
much information on where it was
très rapidement
actually
après le début de la guerre,
localized.
ses camarades
At the beginning of the
écrivent sur
war,
les
very
forums,
quickly,
on arrête un
those
peu nos
comrades
activités parce que
were writing on the forum that they
un
were stopping those
collègue,
activities because we lost one of our
possiblement
colleagues,
en lien avec la guerre. Donc,
possibly because of the
petit
war.
step back de l'activité
So this was a kind of
cette menace,
setback of that
pour apprendre
particular
quelques mois
activity
plus
in
tard
terms
que
of threat.
l'opérateur en question
And
avait
soon it
quitté
was
l'Ukraine
found
et a
out
été
that the
arrêté
organization
aux
had
Pays-Bas
left Ukraine and
pour
was
être
arrested
extradé
in
ensuite
the
aux
Netherlands and was
États-Unis.
extradited
Donc
to the
voilà, c'est là où on
United
se rend
States.
compte des deux côtés
So we can notice
de la guerre que
on
les
both
impacts
sides of the war,
vont vraiment au-delà
the
du
impact
numérique, de l'espace
goes
numérique et
beyond the
informatique,
digital
et
scene.
que les événements géopolitiques majeurs
The
ils ont
geopolitical
des
events
impacts réels sur
have
l'évolution
a
de la
very
menace,
significant impact
en tout cas sur le court et
on
moyen
those
terme.
groups, short and medium term.
Et est-ce qu'en Europe, par exemple, avec des
How about in Europe, in terms of the rules of not reimbursing the ransomware?
ça coûte de l'argent si,
We know that it also costs a lot to attack a company.
Il y a un grand chiffre, il y a leur
Is there a significant profit for them, or but is there? But can we also notice a significant decrease in revenue, and now they actually need more money?
Une organisation très ciblée.
So will they? What organizations will they tap into?
Et voilà, on revient à la question du ciblage.
We were discussing targeting
ça reste
earlier,
sur une menace opportuniste.
and it's often
Ça
these
veut
kind of
dire
opportunistic
que,
threats.
elles restent opportunistes
They are
pour les
opportunistic
portes d'entrée. Donc,
for
on va
in terms of
entrer,
entry,
à
points
chaque
of
fois qu'on trouve
entry.
une porte ouverte,
Every time there is a point
en
of
revanche,
entry.
pour exploiter et pour maximiser le gain,
However, in order to maximize gain, to optimize it all, they adapt it to multiple extortion techniques.
Quand on a un accès vraiment
When there
tel
is
le
an
maximum,
access
donc on va pas se limiter que à
that is
menacer les
quite
victimes avec le
maximized,
chiffrement
that is
de données,
optimized.
mais on va les appeler, on va monter des call centers
There will be call
avec des
centers that
personnes qui
are
parlent toutes les
being
langues
brought
du monde,
up.
Et qui vont appeler les victimes, leur mettre la pression.
So they will be able to communicate with the victims and put pressure on them. So you'll call all the entire network of friends, family around the victim.
Si vos données finissent sur notre
If
site
your
public,
data ends up on our website, this will have a much larger impact for the victim's life. This is a kind of victimology. We can see a number from Latin America or Southeast Asia. So the victims will be paying less. Can that be linked to the fact that also linked to the fluctuation of Bitcoin?
Cet élément en tête également.
that should also be kept in mind.
Est-ce que les entreprises font des backups plus
Do
régulièrement? Je l'espère, donc
businesses
peut-être
set
que le
up
chiffrement
kinds
leur
of
fait pas
backups?
autant peur, ou encore la menace peut-être
Or
est déjà
even
plus entrée dans le grand
a
public.
threat that's
donc
even more
voilà, il est un peu
brought out
moins
to the public.
mystifié,
It's less mystified,
ça fait moins
less
d'impact
of a secrecy,
sur la réputation, même
and
si
it's less
c'est
impact
encore
on
toujours le
the
cas.
reputation of these groups.
En tout cas, voilà, c'est ce que les rapports un peu disent que les
That's what the
paiements ont
report
baissé.
tells us.
Une autre
Payments have
hypothèse serait le fait
decreased.
que le groupe
And our
Conti,
hypothesis
le groupe
is that
ransomware qui
the
était
group Conti,
pas
for
démantelé,
example,
qui a décidé lui-même d'arrêter
that hadn't been
leur
dismantled,
activité sous la chapelle
they had
du nom de
stopped
Conti.
their
Est-ce que ça a pris un peu de
their
temps pour
activity?
les
Did it take a bit of time for affiliates
ça a été prouvé
to
d'ailleurs, ils
actually
sont partis
regroup?
ou créer
That
d'autres
was
groupes,
proven
et c'est peut-être ça qui
when
a
they went
créé
to
un peu
join
une
other
baisse
groups, and that's also
activités,
what
et c'est pour
decreased
ça
their
peut-être qu'on
activity.
voit en ce début
And that's perhaps
d'année
also
une
why we
reprise
can
des
see at the
activités
beginning
du
of
groupe
this year
Il y a plein d'éléments,
decrease in
on
the
n'est pas, quand on n'est pas les
activity.
forces de l'ordre, on n'a pas tous les éléments,
When
on peut pas
we're not
faire
on
beaucoup
the legal
d'attributions et
side, we
des
cannot
hypothèses,
really make such clear
affirmer
attributions
ou infirmer
that
des
are
hypothèses,
affirmed,
mais voilà, il y a
but
tous
we
ces
can notice
éléments-là.
some of these key elements.
N'hésitez pas à remettre en question ou compléter si besoin.
You can also raise some further questions if you like, or
de force de l'ordre cette année. Cody, pretty much the same question, but in English. In Europe, we are less strict on the forbidden of the payment of the ransom. But we saw in US, there is more politics about this whole payment. What do you think is more appropriate? Which politics is better?
Well, I think that it seems to be changing a little bit in Europe too, right? The Network Information Security Directive 2 is, if I understand correctly, planning to mandate certain disclosures. I think that that's not going to be effective until something like late 2024. Similar in the U.S., by the way, where where CISA has plans to mandate reporting requirements for certain sectors, but that is not yet effective. So I think this is a rather controversial issue. I think it really boils down to issuing ransomware payments. I think that the U.S. FBI has formal advice not to pay, and I think that's what you're alluding to partly. And that's largely because, first, there's really no assurance that you will have your data fully unlocked. There's also great harm that can be done from that, from paying the ransom, since then it shows that it works, right? The threat actors will receive payment. I think that it's very challenging, though, because obviously when you have schools, when you have hospitals targeted, it then transitions into a really, I would say, almost a human rights issue. So I think that there's room for debate on all sides of this, but I think that broadly, the result of this is that your intention needs to be to stay left of boom, which means that you should be using threat intelligence, you should be using these sorts of tools if you are able, and of course not everyone's able, and especially education sector, healthcare sector is often under-resourced, and then more commonly targeted. So I think that it is that we are all reliant on law enforcement and, as I said earlier, intelligence authorities to help solve this problem for us. But my personal view is that the reporting requirements are and I hesitate to say this because I know there are some people in the audience who don't think so, but they are overall a good thing, even though they're very, very difficult for a lot of organizations.
Is it easier in the US to use all the resources to counter them? Maybe we don't have this kind of mindset in Europe.
All government resources? I think that increasingly so, to allude to what I mentioned earlier with the, I guess you could say, formal designation of ransomware as a national security threat. The intent behind that is to allow the U.S. to then leverage all instruments of national power, which is, as we know, rather substantial. I do think that also obligates the U.S. to, or actually, I wouldn't say obligates, I would say a result of that is that the U.S. also assists allies and others around the world. I don't see a scenario, for example, where, let's say, there was a ransomware group that was scared out of North America and retained Western European targets, Eastern European or Central European targets, and the U.S. thought, okay, hands off. So, in other words, I think that probably the whole world benefits, not to sound like an arrogant American, but I think that all of the resources that you can leverage for this will be helpful, and we're also seeing a lot of international cooperation on this with the French government, Dutch government, UK, US, everyone, I think, is really focused on this. So I don't want to say it's a NATO problem set, because it's really not. And of course, NATO right now has its hands full with other cyber issues that are somewhat related. But I think that it's almost a similar analogy where you will see allied participation in this issue.
Si je peux me permettre de rebondir à Bogdan, sauf si quelqu'un d'autre voulait parler à ce sujet, mais pour redescendre un peu à une vision d'analyse.
Just to come back on my point of view as an analyst on the operational aspect, that the consequences of this type of initiative was already mentioned with the colonial pipeline,
l'attaque qui a fait
the attack
qui a remonté un peu le sujet ransomware à très très haut niveau.
Came back the ransomware topic in high spheres, and this is at this moment that the American authorities mentioned these ransomware groups and saying that we should not pay ransom to terrorist groups. It would be impossible. And it's not the effect that this ransomware want to do. So as a consequence, this group always put in the internal regulation and their recruiting mentions, saying that these critical sectors cannot be attacked anymore. And it is the Lockbit group that mentioned this type of targeting or non-targeting, which is the most detailed, with different categories, subcategories. For example, we can target a hospital, but what kind of hospital? This type we cannot target anymore. And they're doing this to escape from the law enforcement and not to attract that much attention from the medias and law enforcement forces. So there are no takedowns, there are no real arrests, but it does trouble their work, and we can see an impact at the medium term.
Imaginons par exemple Corbeil-Essonnes, c'est l'erreur.
Let's imagine, for example, Corbeil-Essonnes, it was a mistake of one of the affiliates.
En tout cas, c'est ce que le
this is what the Lockbit said very often.
Nous, on lit ça, on analyse
when we read this, we analyze it, but how much can we trust them? And that's another question.
Possiblement juste
but
un argument pour
that could be just one argument to say, no, we're not responsible for this. But it is one of the they really like to mention when every time there is a company that is under target. Every time they say sending unciphering for free to the victim, say sorry, there was a story, like a new trainee that didn't know you were that you were not supposed to be targeted.
Karim, with all these things, how do you see these groups evolve? Will they target like more small companies maybe to make less noise?
I think it's definitely hard to speculate. So there's a lot of assumptions into what might happen, but definitely with the United States actually kind of coming up with a sanction list of actually countries globally, right? So not to pay ransoms against that. What's going to happen as a result of that is organization will obviously try and work more, report more. There's a lot of underreporting. Definitely. So they will try to work more to report those cases, but equally they will try to focus more on their increasing their cyber hygiene posture, right? So there's equally, and I think something that has been mentioned before, which is the ransom itself. The amount of ransom is actually the amount of ransomware cases is maybe lowering, but what's going to happen, I think, and again, this is a speculation, is probably they're going to go against targets that can afford to pay those ransoms. So the ransoms will probably increase in terms of the ransom amount, and we've seen that happening, right? So over the last 2 years, the ransom amounts have actually increased dramatically, right? So there's also a method of probably kind of doing a re-extortion, which is coming back to the same groups that have previously, or organizations that have previously paid the amounts, and trying to kind of get more out of those. So there's a mix of different targets for sure. One thing that we also kind of are observing is nation states masking and using those groups, which I earlier made the same point, and masking those operations, kind of weaponizing those ransomware gangs to do more destruction as well, right? So there's equally a different agenda there being driven, while on the apparent side, what we see is kind of a lucrative, and it's definitely a very lucrative business and an economy actually, but equally there's a different agenda that is, hey, we want to do more destruction. And we've seen that with number of cases, right? So whether it's with the Colonial Pipeline, whether it's with others as well, right? So it's hard to tell, right? So it's definitely hard to tell, but they could either go on easier targets and on the lower end of the spectrum, or kind of really more targeted larger organizations to increase their chances of actually getting higher amount of ransoms. And actually in our investigations, we've seen both scenarios, right? So we've seen those cases happening at the two ends of the spectrums.
Yeah, and so on the, I think that's a few notable points. One is that on the reporting issue, if we do see ransomware actors shifting towards the lower end, hypothetically, with the reporting requirements, if everyone has to report and nobody pays, or everyone has some sort of assistance when they report, which is, I think, the other half of that requirement. You cannot mandate reporting if you are not going to help, right? Because that will just lead to a lot of very tragic situations. So this is actually part of this broad reporting dialogue. But something that we say in intelligence is that the adversary will adapt, right? So threat, we usually define as adversary capability by adversary intent. So we know that the intent will always be there, because it's to make money. This is usually financially driven, usually. Not always. There are actually some other edge cases, but it is usually financially driven. So we'll always have that intent. Capability is what we are trying to defeat, right? That's what NetWitness wants to defeat, Sequoia wants to defeat, Eclectic IQ wants to defeat. But, and with some of that success that we've seen with better hygiene, would-be victims having more backups, having instant response procedures, having remediation procedures, in other words, listening to our help, right, which is fantastic, adversaries now are adapting. And one of the ways that we're seeing that is they are using double extortion. So Karim mentioned that earlier, and that means that now they know that if they victimize you, then you may have backups. You may say, okay, fine, not going to pay because I can just remediate this. So the next step is they actually steal stuff, sensitive information about your executives, intellectual property for unreleased software, you name it, and say, we will release this unless you pay the ransom. And I think that we will see more evolution of that. And I think that when you look at the, I was going to say hypothetical, but when you look at more destructive malware, there's really no reason why they wouldn't go that far. So I think we will see more of that evolution and adaptation. Unfortunately, the more successful we are.
Just a last question, but everyone of you can answer. Since their money is the problem, could you strike their wallet? Mostly it's Bitcoin, some crypto, and we saw that there have been arrested of cyber criminals specialized on founding, on mixing this crypto to hide the accounts. Is this the plan of the whole operation, to at least strike maybe the platform where you can say that I hacked this one, pay here please, and at the same time strike their wallet? Whatever.
Maybe you can actually clarify, are you saying identify the wallet owner and then go after them?
The owner and the company.
Yeah, well, actually, I've been speaking more, so why don't you go? Why don't you go first, then I'll add to it.
Right, so let me take this one. Obviously, it's definitely a hard, for sure. It's we can debate on the capability of actually going after. Let me understand that correctly. Just going after the wallet owner from a law enforcement or from a ransomware gang point of view. Just a matter of clarification.
Yeah, sure. In the plan of the law enforcement to seize their wallet or the people that are helping them hiding this money.
Right. But that's a tough one. But obviously, law enforcement we're seeing that they're kind of doing their best. There's all those kind of regulations that are now seeing the light, right? In terms of, it starts with reporting, but then when it moves to law enforcement, it moves into all kind of possibilities that you can, and so we shouldn't exclude any possibility of actually targeting wallet owners. Now, there's a challenge technically to kind of really identify, right? Because there's a lot of hidden, especially in the crypto world, there's a lot of hidden, there's a lot of technical challenges around really properly identifying who's the wallet owner, right? So, and that's not something we can exclude in terms of a possibility, but once it reaches that stage, I think we're in the realm of everything is possible from a obviously I'm not the best suited person to kind of discuss on behalf of law enforcement in terms of capabilities, but right, so one thing is for sure that we've seen is with Hive and others, with the joint operations in Germany and the US, and those were more in the form of physical, right? So just kind of really tracing them down and trying to kind of like in the old way, in the classic way, really trying to kind of target those organizations. There's a bit more challenges to do that in terms of in the digital space, right? So again, something up that we can put up for a debate, but those are just some views from my side.
Et puis je pourrais compléter pour dire.
I just want to complete saying where I don't have the answer of how we could do it, but should we? Yes, absolutely. And I really like to insist on the fact that today we are facing a threat that is more and more professional and specialized. We are talking a lot about ransomware. Why? Because it is the one we can observe the most. It's a very hot topic with critical victims. It's very visible for the broad public.
C'est un peu vraiment le pic de l'iceberg.
But yeah, we are just the top of the iceberg, because behind we have a whole ecosystem that is very interconnected. It often started with info stealers stealing data, providing to all actors like brokers. Once they have initial access, they sell it to the ransomware actors that will deploy the malware, the ransomware that will exfiltrate data that will be sold once again. They also using a mixer and a crypto transfer for this ransomware that are received in Bitcoin, so they have to be laundered. So there is a whole ecosystem. So yes, addressing only the ransomware, which is the final point of this ecosystem, it might not be the best practice, but we can see it more and more. I mean, the day before yesterday, we could see that Genesis was taken down, which was a cyber marketplace. We had some detail. They took like tens of millions of infected machines in real time. So I can just confirm that addressing all the different steps, all different aspects from the beginning to the very end, and the sooner possible to this ecosystem would be better. This way we wouldn't have reached this number of ransomware attacks.
I think there is a webcomic that some of you have most likely seen from XKCD, where there's no joke that the U.S. National Security Agency, when trying to identify someone who is using encryption, might go through all this trouble to, decrypt it or crack it or use, quantum computing, something like that, versus the CIA will just go beat the guy up, steal the key, and then unlock it that way. And I think that that applies a little bit here, where you will see authorities, of course, are very interested in unmasking who is behind wallets. But if you use, as previously discussed, full instruments of national power for Western countries, then that also means that there are other means of figuring out who is accessing wallets without actually unmasking who owns the wallet. You can figure out who some of these threat actors are, and then go after them that way. And of course, then you run into the usual challenges that we've already seen of, well, they're in the Russian Federation, or these various challenges. But I also think that there are firms out there that are having a lot of success using a mixture of proprietary methods and highly skilled research that all three of our teams do to figure out who is actually behind some of these wallets. And it's very challenging when they are using Monero, for instance, which is still hard to unmask. Maybe it's achievable, but it's not really that publicly known if it is. But there has been more success with this increasingly, and there was a very famous case of a school in the Netherlands in 2019 at Maastricht University that was locked out. They actually did pay the ransom, which at that time was about, I think, 40 or 50,000 euros. And then last year, the Dutch Public Protection Service figured out how to actually refund that. And then it was worth 500,000 euros. Now, I want to be clear, that's not a net gain, because the expense to reputational damage, for remediation, and all the other associated expenses actually normally outweigh any ransom, another reason not to pay. But I do think that as we all collectively work on this, we will probably have increasing success with unmasking.
Well, thank you, the three of you. I learned a lot for myself, and I hope it's the same for the audience. I think we have 2 or 3 minutes if someone has a question here in the audience. No? Okay, thank you.